Today we are going to do the lesson A Triumph of Surgery written by James Herriot from the book Footprints Without Feet. This is for standard 10. Introduction to the chapter. Tricky, a small dog, is overfed and pampered by his rich mistress. He falls seriously ill and his mistress then consults a veterinary surgeon. Does he perform the operation? Does Tricky recover? All your answers will be solved in the following slides. The main characters of the story are Tricky, who was a small dog and was excessively loved and pampered by his mistress, Mrs. Pumphrey. He was greedy and he loved food very much, but he had no exercise. Mrs. Pumphrey was a wealthy woman and loved her dog too much. She gave him little extras between the meals. She gave him a lot to eat but never made him exercise. Once he fell ill, she was frantic and upset, and she then called Herriot the vet. James Herriot, the narrator, an extremely tactful and sensible veterinarian, was shocked to see a bloated dog like a sausage. He had already advised Mrs. Pumphrey to cut down on sweet. Since Tricky refused to eat the balanced diet, Mrs. Pumphrey called him. He told her that Tricky needed immediate hospitalization for keeping under observation. This is an autobiographical experience written by James Herriot. The narrator was shocked to see Tricky when he stopped his car. He was shocked at his appearance because he was extremely fat, eyes bloodshot, stared straight, tongue lolled from his jaws. Mrs. Pumphrey explained that Tricky was listless, had no energy, and she thought he might be suffering from malnutrition. So she started giving him extra meals, some malt, some cod liver oil, bowl of Horlicks, and she did not cut down on the sweets. The main trouble began. Mr. Herriot looked at the dog, and Tricky's fault was greed. He never refused for any food that was served to him. Mr. Herriot asks Mrs. Pumphrey about Tricky's exercise routine. She says he goes for little walks, but there was no ring throwing as the gardener has been down with lumbago. Mr. Herriot advises Mrs. Pumphrey to cut his food right down, give him more exercise, keep him on a strict diet. Mrs. Pumphrey resisted, saying it is difficult, and went back home. Tricky fell ill and refused his favorite dishes. He had bouts of vomiting. He did not go for walks. He spent all his time lying on the rug. Mr. Herriot then suggested that Tricky should be hospitalized. He carried away the little dog wrapped in a blanket, despite the poor lady's wailings. The maids rushed in and out, bringing his day bed, favorite cushions, toys, breakfast bowl. But all this couldn't be put in the car, so Mrs. Pumphrey threw coats through the window. Mr. Herriot drove away. Everybody was in tears. Tricky's treatment began in the clinic. His bed was made in a warm, loose box near to where the other dogs slept. No medical treatment was given. He gave him no food but plenty of water. He started showing interest in his surrounding. He gradually started recovering. All day he ran around with the dogs. He discovered the joys of being bowled over and tramped on. He became an accepted member of the gang. He fought like a tiger during his meals, hunted rats in the old hen house at night. Later, a lot of things were sent for Tricky. Mrs. Pumphrey called Mr. Herriot a dozen times to inquire about Tricky's health. She inquired if he wore the correct coat according to the weather, his cushions being turned regularly, and whether he was healthy. Mr. Herriot told her that the little fellow was out of danger. A lot of things were sent for Tricky: round fresh eggs, 2 dozen at a time, to build up Tricky's strength. Wine was sent to enrich Tricky's blood. All these things were not given to Tricky but were consumed by Mr. Herriot and his friends. Mr. Herriot was tempted to keep Tricky as a permanent guest, but Mrs. Pumphrey was suffering. Tricky gradually recovered. He told her that the little dog had recovered and was awaiting collection. In 2 weeks, he transformed into a hard muscular animal. Tricky, as well as Mrs. Pumphrey, were excited. Mr. Herriot carried Tricky to the front of the house. Tricky saw his mistress and jumped off from Mr. Herriot's arms into Mrs. Pumphrey's lap. He started licking her face and barked with excitement. She leaned out of the window and tears in her eyes. "Oh, Mr. Herriot," she cried, "how can I thank you? This is the triumph of surgery." I hope you have understood the chapter. Please go through the chapter and read the story once. Thank you.